Hello all, welcome to History Lessons. As in the previous video we saw about the economy of Europe on the eve of French Revolution, today in this video I will show you slides on the society of Europe on the eve of French Revolution. Now, generally speaking, the 18th century Europe nourished the legacies of medieval European society. The social structure on the European continent still bore an aristocratic imprint, the legacy of an era, because as it is said earlier in the previous slide while discussing about the economy, that land was virtually the sole source of wealth. Those who owned it assumed all rights over those who tilled it. The social hierarchy was divided into orders, estates, or stand. There were three estates in which the people were divided: the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners. The first two, that is the clergy and the nobility, belonged to the first and second estates or état respectively, whereas the latter one, that is the commoners, whose participants were colossal in size and diverse in nature, belonged to the third. All those who had no qualification of high birth were lumped together in the third estate. According to the famous historian Georges Lefebvre, this social hierarchy and division was actually a policy of pursuing, that is, a policy of divide and rule. The state maintained a corporate structure with the governing principles from top to bottom resting on inequality of rights. Throughout Western Europe, and especially in France, this ordering of society was being challenged by a long-term change which increased the importance of mobile wealth and of the bourgeois, emancipated the lower classes, and highlighted the leading role of productive labor, inventive intelligence, and scientific knowledge. Now, let us see the first état, or the clergy. Now, the clergy was an important section of European society and were known as the first état. In no country did the clergy constitute more than a small minority of the total population. In France, as it is estimated at approximately 130,000 members in the social class of clergies. Now, higher clergies had a close affinity with the aristocracy. They had an extravagant life as they derived large income from the vast landed estates of the monasteries and bishoprics. The church also collected a tax besides religious tax known as the tithe, which was the 1/10 of the total produce, whereas the lower clergy or the parish clergy were relatively poor and lived a chaste and sedate life. Clergy enjoyed a great influence on the society, especially in the Catholic countries. Now, traditionally, since divine right made throne and altar manually dependent, the prince imposed his religion on his subjects. The established church alone was privileged to conduct public worship. It kept the official registers of births, marriages, and deaths, and it also controlled education and poor relief. The church also controlled the freedom of thought, and intellectual activities were censored. New ideas and publications were scrutinized by the church and declared valid or profane. Illiterate and ignorant masses feared the church and desisted from anything disapproved by the church. Now, the situations were different in the non-Catholic churches. Wherever the Reformation had triumphed, church supremacy had been broken. The ruler of a Protestant state, primate of his church, considered ecclesiastical ministers his auxiliaries. In Protestant countries, church property had been partly secularized and monastic orders had been entirely suppressed. An attitude of free thought fostered a multitude of sects which were tolerated. Although there was not complete freedom of conscience, dissenters were deprived of certain rights, Catholics were often subject to stringent regulation, society comprised Christians only, the Jews being considered an outsider, and the atheists as someone altogether excluded from the social relations. Protestant ministers were educated at the universities and absorbed rationalist thoughts. Rarely did the Protestant church enter into conflict with the state, and its moral influence over society remained. In case of Russia, the Tsar headed the Orthodox Church, and Catherine the Great had secularized much of the church's property. The Russian Empire, embracing a great many diverse people, allowed them to practice various faiths, confining its activities to the Orthodox, who were prohibited from changing their religion or stumbling into the pitfall of heresy. Now, the second estate, or the nobility. The nobility were another important European society and were a part of the second estate after the clergies. Now, they were a privileged class who thrived on their landed estates, which were tilled by serfs belonging to various manors. They also were the virtual ruler of the country, as they held the most important positions in the government and ran the administration and also fought in the battles. The nobles averred from manual labor and distinguished themselves in whiling away their leisure in hunting, fighting duels, and they even patronized various art forms and artists. The nobility, like the clergy, constituted no more than a small part of the population, but estimates of its size vary. CS, in case of France, estimated almost 110,000 nobles, and more importantly, nobility was hereditary. In principle, it could be conferred only by birth, and noble blood was to be kept free from contamination through misalliance. The aristocrat considered himself racially distinct from the ignoble commoner. His manner of living was regarded as an illustration of his dignity. He wore the sword. His profession was that of bearing arms. Born to serve as counselor to the king, he consented to serve as ministers, diplomat, governor, or even political administrator. But the changing economy which associated power with money had injured the feudal nobility to a large extent. War no longer offered booty or ransom, and it exhausted the nobleman's patrimony, already eaten by rising prices, increasing extravagance, and division of land through inheritance. As a result, great disparities in wealth and in manner of living had developed within the nobility. But as members of the aristocracy fell behind, their places in the ranks were filled by members of the bourgeois. Now, the third estate. As it is said in a previous slide, that other than the clergy and the nobility, rest of the society were lumped together and named as a third estate. This, however, does not mean that the third estate was homogeneous in nature. Professionals like the lawyers, physicians, teachers, rich and ordinary merchants, peasants, serfs, workers, sapulots were all included in this third estate. The rich merchants and capitalists had the wealth, but due to their lower born status, they could not become aristocrats. At the lower strata were the sapulots and the serfs, who were the most dominated class. Despite the third estate's enormous size and economic importance, it played almost no role in the government or decision-making of the Austrian regime. The frustrations, grievances, and sufferings of the third estate became pivotal causes of the French Revolution. Now, within the third estate, one of the most important section was the peasantry. Peasants inhabited the bottom tier of the third estate's social hierarchy, comprising between 82 and 88% of the population. Sometimes it is estimated even more than 90% of the total population. And they were the nation's poorest social class. While levels of wealth and income varied, it is reasonable to suggest that most French peasants were poor. A very small percentage of peasants owned land in their own right and were able to live independently as yeoman farmers. The vast majority, however, were feudal tenants, who were called métayers, that is, tenant sharecroppers who worked someone else's land, or journaliers, that is, day laborers who sought work where they could find it. Whatever their personal situation, all peasants were heavily taxed by the state. If they were feudal tenants, peasants were also required to pay dues to their local seigneur or lord. If they belonged to a parish, as most did, they were expected to pay an annual tithe to the church. These obligations were seldom relaxed, even during difficult periods such as poor harvests, when many peasants were pushed to the brink of starvation. Now, another important section of the third etat were the urban dwellers. They lived and worked in France's towns and cities. While the 18th century was a period of industrial and urban growth in France, most cities remained comparatively small. There were only 9 French cities with a population of exceeding 50,000 people. Paris, with around 650,000, was by far the largest. Most commoners in the towns and cities made a living as merchants, skilled artisans, or unskilled workers. Artisans worked in industries like textile and clothing manufacture, furniture, clock making, blacksmithing, leather goods, carriage making and repair, carpentry, and masonry. A few artisans operated their own business, but most worked for large firms or employers. Before doing business or gaining employment, an artisan had to belong to the guild that managed and regulated his particular industry. Unskilled laborers worked as servants, cleaners, water carriers, washermen, hawkers, in short, anything that did not require training or membership of a guild. Many Parisians, perhaps as many as 80,000 people, had no job at all. They survived by begging, scavenging, petty crime, or prostitution. The lives of urban workers became increasingly difficult in the 1780s. Parisian workers toiled for meager wages between 30 and 60 sous a day for skilled laborers and 15 to 20 sous a day for the unskilled. Wages rose by around 20% in the 25 years before 1789. However, prices and rents increased by 60% in the same period. The poor harvests of 1788 and 1789 pushed Parisian workers to the brink by driving up bread prices. In early 1789, the price of 4-pound loaf of bread in Paris increased from 9 sous to 14.5 sous, almost a full day's pay for most unskilled laborers. Low pay and high food prices were compounded by the miserable living conditions in Paris. Accommodation in the capital was so scarce that workers and their families crammed into shared attics and dirty tenements, most rented from unscrupulous landlords. With rents running at several sous a day, most workers economized by sharing accommodation. Many rooms housed between 6 and 10 people, though 12 to 15 per room was not unknown. Conditions in these tenements were cramped, unhygienic, and uncomfortable. The toilet facilities were usually an outside cesspit or open sewer, while water was fetched by hand from communal wells. Now, the most important section of the third estate, the bourgeois. As mentioned earlier, not all members of the third estate were homogeneous, so not all members of the third estate were impoverished. At the apex of the third estate's social hierarchy was the bourgeois or the capitalist middle classes. The bourgeois were business owners and professionals with enough wealth to live comfortably. As with the peasantry, there was also diversity within their ranks. The so-called petty bourgeois or small bourgeois were small-scale traders, landlords, shopkeepers, and managers. The haute bourgeois or high bourgeois were wealthy merchants and traders, colonial landholders, industrialists, bankers and financiers, tax farmers, and trained professionals such as doctors and lawyers. The bourgeois flourished during the 1700s, due in part of France's economic growth, modernization, increased production, imperial expansion, and foreign trade. The high bourgeois rose from the middle classes to become independently wealthy, well-educated, and ambitious. As their wealth increased, so did their desire for social status and political representation. Many bourgeois craved entry into the second état. They had money to acquire the costumes and grand residences of the noble classes, but lacked their titles, privileges, and prestige. A system of venality evolved that allowed the wealthiest of the bourgeois to buy their way into the nobility. Though by 1780s this was becoming more difficult and frightfully expensive, the thwarted social and political ambitions of the bourgeois led to considerable frustration. The high bourgeois had become the economic masters of the nation, yet government and policy remained the domain of the royalty and nobles remained favorites. Many educated bourgeois found solace in Enlightenment tracts which challenged the foundation of monarchical power and argued that government should be representative, accountable, and based on popular sovereignty. When Emmanuel C.S. published What is the Third État in January 1789, it struck a chord with the self-important bourgeois, many of whom believed themselves entitled to a hand in government. What is the Third État was not the only expression of this idea. There was a flood of similar pamphlets and essays around the nation in early 1789. When these documents spoke of the Third État, however, they referred chiefly to the bourgeois, not to France's 22 million rural peasants, landless laborers, or urban workers. When the bourgeois dreamed of representative government, it was a government that represented the proprietor classes only. The peasants and urban workers were politically invisible to the bourgeois, just as the bourgeois was itself politically invisible to the Osho regime.